If we are to believe the latest rumors, Joe Espada and Pedro Grifol have impressed the White Sox organization during their respective interviews, and it sure seems like an actual managerial search is happening at 35th and Shields. White Sox starter Dylan Cease was a joy to watch in 2022 as he built upon his previous body of work. What can we expect in 2023?
You are Locked On White Sox, your daily Chicago White Sox podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Sox fans, welcome to Locked On White Sox. Thank you for making Locked On White Sox your first listen each and every day. We're free and available on all platforms. Follow us on Twitter at Locked On Sox. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just search Locked On White Sox. Hey, I'm your host, Nick Borowski, a lifelong diehard Chicago White Sox fan, recording this podcast just blocks from the ballpark in beautiful Bridgeport. You can find me on Twitter at Nick_GGTB. Really appreciate you letting me steal some of your time to talk White Sox. Locked On White Sox is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Dylan Cease provided countless memorable moments during a White Sox season that really crushed all of our souls. Despite the amazing season, is Dylan Cease untouchable? And are the White Sox closer to hiring their next manager? Of course, talking Chicago White Sox off season, a season in 2022 where we saw the Sox perfectly 500, 81-81, finishing second place in the AL Central, 11 games back from the Cleveland Guardians that are one game away from the ALCS. It is White Sox managerial search 2022. Every day there seems to be new rumors, new reports, leading candidates, and then you maybe turn to other folks that you possibly trust, and they will say the opposite from a different source. You will see on the internet, social media, what have you. According to John Morrissey of the MLB Network and contributor to 670 The Score, Pedro Grifol and Joe Espada have impressed the Chicago White Sox officials in the interview process. Sources say, that's always my favorite part. Additional managerial candidates are believed to be involved, with a final decision possible before the end of the month. So a lot to unpack there. We've heard these two names quite a bit over the last few weeks, and maybe even going back to before, while Tony La Russa was on medical leave. You started to hear some of these names, and these names are really not, they're not brand new names. They've been around baseball for a long time. And we'll start with a guy like Pedro Grifol. Current Kansas City Royals bench coach, has been in that position for a while, was a catcher during his playing days, drafted by the Minnesota Twins in the early 1990s, but really he was just a career minor leaguer. Grifol has been through this managerial interview process before with other teams in the past, and maybe this will finally be his chance. And you've got to assume that the Chicago White Sox brass, the officials that John Morrissey spoke of, are familiar with Pedro Grifol has done, being that the Kansas City Royals are in the AL Central. Joe Espada, another name that is on a lot of folks' it's their top of their list, their wish list. And he, of course, current bench coach for the Houston Astros. Houston Astros have already advanced to the ALCS. Joe Espada, another career minor league player, played with a bunch of organizations. He was the third base coach for the Marlins from 2010 through 2013, which means Joe Espada was there when Ozzie Guillen managed the Marlins in 2012. In 2015, Espada went to the New York Yankees as an infield and third base coach, and then was hired by the Astros after the 2017 season to be their bench coach. Joe Espada has also been through the interview process before. In 2018, he interviewed with the Texas Rangers, and in 2019, interviewed with the Chicago Cubs. The big question, I guess, is what will happen with the Houston Astros? They sure seem like a powerhouse once again. Now, if it's Astros, Yankees, I don't know. Now, will Dusty Baker, will he leave? Say the Astros win the World Series, or maybe they just simply advance to the World Series, they lose. Will Dusty Baker leave after this season? And with that happening, perhaps Houston they're already thinking Joe Espada is going to be the guy that, we want to move into that role. Now, I'm assuming the Astros, maybe they don't know what's going on with Dusty Baker. Joe Espada obviously has interviewed with the White Sox. What's the White Sox, what's their play right here? I feel like you've got to act fast. I'm assuming the Sox just do not have unlimited time, especially since there are a handful of other teams looking to fill the same position. Mentioned Ozzie before, of course, with that stint with the Marlins, and that he most likely crossed paths, of course, with Joe Espada. Bruce Levine on Ozzie Guillen becoming the White Sox next manager. This was what Bruce Levine had to say, quote, "All I know from what I hear is he has not been ruled out," end quote. So in the previous Locked On Sox episode, I mentioned Bob Nightingale throwing names out like Schilt and Bochy and Washington. And of course, Joe Maddon has been tied to all of these open managerial jobs. Maddon still wants to manage if the fit is right. Are the Chicago White Sox really doing it here? Are they doing an actual managerial search? It sure feels that way right now, if we're to believe, of course, all of these folks that are coming out and saying they've got information and they know sources and they have them. It already feels different than in 2020. And folks, different is good. I do believe the White Sox should be looked as a coveted team. There's a ton of big league talent coming back in 2023, and perhaps nobody is more exciting than Dylan Cease. So many highlights during Dylan Cease's 2022 campaign. I'm going to tell you how Cease changed the game this past season. More on that in a moment. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every game you can find. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in all your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Now, I'm not big on handing out letter grades for players or for the team. Look, the White Sox failed in 2022. They did not come close to achieving their goals, and of course, the ultimate prize, winning the World Series. But Dylan Cease is one of the few players on this team that you could give out perhaps an A, maybe an A plus. And the question remains, is Dylan Cease untouchable? And if there is such a thing as untouchables on the Chicago White Sox roster, and I'm not sure if there are, Dylan Cease is indeed untouchable. This is the type of guy you want leading the starting rotation. Dylan Cease, of course, was acquired in a trade with the Chicago Cubs and made his debut for the White Sox July 3rd, 2019. I was in attendance for that game. It was also the Jose Abreu Silver Slugger bobblehead day game. What a great day to be at. Cease started 14 games in 2019 and 12 games in the shortened 2020 season with mixed reviews, but things definitely improved in 2021. Here was Cease in last season in 2021. He had a record of 13-7, 3.91 ERA, started 32 games, pitched 165 innings, gave up 139 hits, 20 home runs, walked 68 batters, and struck out 226 hitters, and again, 165 innings. Not bad numbers in 2021, something that we were looking forward to after kind of a mediocre play in 19 and in 20. Well, this past season, Dylan Cease improved on almost all of those numbers. His record in 2022 for the White Sox, of course, 14-7, 2.20 ERA. Once again, started 32 games. He takes the ball. He stayed healthy. 184 innings pitched for Cease. Gave up only 126 hits, 16 home runs. That number is down. Now, he walked 78 batters this past season, which led all of Major League Baseball, and improved his strikeout by one. Struck out 227 batters in 2022. So Dylan Cease's win total went up. ERA was improved. The innings pitched, that increased, and he increased, of course, his strikeout by one. It's that walking batters that went up 10, and that has been a bugaboo for Dylan Cease. You know, he's a strikeout pitcher, you know, and sometimes, especially after a few hitters, you know, after a lineup has seen him a couple times, it gets a little bit tricky to wipe a guy out. And he'll have, you know, sometimes longer at bats, and those counts will go full. And that's where those walks, but it didn't really get him into trouble too much in 2022. He was exciting to watch. How about it? The highlight, of course, and there are a lot of them, but the highlight, the one hitter against Minnesota on September 3rd, came down to absolutely the end with Luis Ariz, and it was not a cheap hit at all. And there was a lot of talk of maybe walking Ariz and going after the next hitter, but I loved what Dylan Cease said after the game. And we're going to attack him. This is how I wanted to do it. The poise that he had throughout that's another, the maturation, you know, that has improved so much since 2021, and how he relished that moment, that one hitter. How about him coming off the mound after the eighth, raising his arms, getting the crowd in more of a frenzy than they already were? I was at the Carlos Rodon no-hitter a season ago, and I don't remember Rodon being that amped at all. Internally, I'm sure he was, but not visually. And there was a sparse crowd. That was an April game. Dylan Cease, this was early September. And boy, that was awesome to watch. And you got to assume that Dylan Cease, after the season he had, will definitely be receiving Cy Young votes. Cease had a stretch of 14 straight starts where he allowed one earned run or less. That was May 29th through August 11th. And within that stretch, there was a span of 5 straight starts where he didn't allow a single earned run. Cease did have his share of rough patches. There was a difficult start against the New York Yankees in May, where he gave up 6 runs in 4 innings, but it's the Yankees. Then a few weeks later, he was touched up for 7 runs in 3 innings against Boston. And of course, Cease did not end his season on a high note against San Diego. However, absolute joy to watch Dylan Cease this past season, and he will only get better in 2023. It can be tricky putting the label ace on a pitcher, but I think Dylan Cease, of course, deserves it, and he will once again be in the Cy Young conversation. More on that in a moment. During an absolutely horrendous, disappointing season for the Chicago White Sox, Dylan Cease was one of the few bright spots on this 2022 team. He was must-see TV. You remember maybe a couple seasons ago, Lucas Giolito was in that category. Must-see, and then go back further, Chris Sale, how about it? And if you were on the fence about going to the game, the fact that Dylan Cease was pitching, that might put you over the edge into attending the game. And without question, he is now the ace of the Chicago White Sox staff, and he should be your 2023 opening day starter. After the White Sox acquired Eloy Jimenez and Dylan Cease from the Cubs for Jose Quintana, I had a conversation with a very good friend of mine that is a lifelong Cubs fan. And he told me that Eloy Jimenez was not necessarily the guy to be excited about. It was Dylan Cease that Sox fans should be really eager to see. My friend mentioned a story that Rick Sutcliffe told on regarding Cease and his ceiling, essentially stating that Dylan Cease had some of the best stuff he's seen from a prospect. Dylan Cease should indeed be the 2023 opening day starter. And with Cy Young expectations, hopefully anchoring a healthy starting rotation out of spring training. Folks, really appreciate you making time for this podcast and making it part of your daily routine. You can find the Locked On White Sox podcast absolutely everywhere you find your podcasts. We are on Twitter at Locked On Sox. You can find me on Twitter at Nick_GGTB. Thanks for making Locked On White Sox your first listen. Now make your second listen the Locked On MLB podcast. MLB expert Paul Francis Sullivan brings humor, passion, and unique perspective on every team and the biggest stories around the league. Follow the #1 daily league-wide podcast, Locked On MLB, on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up on the next episode, I will dive a little deeper into individual player performances like Eloy Jimenez and continue to look at off-season options. Really appreciate you making time for the Locked On White Sox podcast. I'm Nick Morawski. Until next time, go Sox.